Hello there. Welcome to video 133 from Sumit Academy. I do hope that you have subscribed to my channel. Do subscribe now so that you do not miss out on my previous or future videos. And do remember to like and share this video too. And if you want to drop in a line, I shall always be available at sumitacademy20@gmail.com. To make your task a little easier, here is a complete list of all the 133 videos available on my YouTube channel. The list is divided into the playlists under which they are available. Do have a look. In my earlier video, which was part 1 of the 3-part series on floods, we had a look at the meaning of floods, their causes and effects, and as to how the government is trying to handle the situation. We also had a look at the probable reason as to why even after more than 70 years of independence, we are still struggling to control the flood situation. In this, the second part of a 3-part series on floods, let us have a look at the National Disaster Management Guidelines on the Management of Floods, issued by the government in January 2008. The stated mission of these guidelines is to minimize vulnerability to floods and consequent loss of lives, livelihood systems, property, and damage to infrastructure and public utilities. With these guidelines, there has been a change of emphasis on the part of the government. The emphasis of the state governments had so far been on structural measures of flood management, requiring huge investment and long gestation period. They had not given due importance to non-structural measures which are very effective in reducing loss of life and properties and do not require huge investment and can be implemented in a short time. These guidelines emphasize on their time-bound implementation by the central ministries and departments and the state governments. The guidelines recognize the fact that there is a lack of coordination among the agencies of the central government and the state governments, as well as among the various departments of the state governments. The guidelines also recognize lack of institutional framework for coordinating the efforts of various agencies and lays emphasis on setting up basin-wise organizations for flood management and a National Flood Management Institute for training, education, and research in management of floods. The mechanisms for interstate and intrastate coordination have also been proposed. Now, what are the objectives of the guidelines? These guidelines rest on certain objectives aimed at increasing the efficacy of the flood management plans. These are, firstly, shifting the focus to preparedness by implementing in a time-bound manner an optimal combination of techno-economically viable, socially acceptable, and eco-friendly structural and non-structural measures of flood management. Secondly, ensuring regular monitoring of the effectiveness and sustainability of various structures and taking appropriate measures for their restoration and strengthening. The third objective of the guidelines is continuous modernization of flood forecasting, early warning, and decision support systems. The fourth objective is ensuring the incorporation of flood resistant features in the design and construction of new structures in the flood prone areas. The fifth objective is drawing up time bound plans for the flood proofing of strategic and public utility structures in flood prone areas. The sixth objective is improving the awareness and preparedness of all stakeholders in the flood prone areas. The seventh objective is introducing appropriate capacity development interventions for effective flood management. Now, this will include education, training, capacity building, research and development, and of course, documentation. The eighth objective is improving the compliance regime through appropriate mechanisms. The ninth and final objective is strengthening the emergency response capabilities. As far as the structure is concerned, these guidelines have been divided into 10 chapters. The first chapter is general in nature and deals with the status and context of floods. the nature and extent of the flood problem in the country, various initiatives taken by the government in managing them, the actions required for a reasonable and reliable assessment of the problem, and collection of the data for the studies leading to systematic and scientific planning and implementation of various interventions to manage floods. These are what are briefly described in these guidelines. The second chapter deals with institutional framework and financial arrangements. It outlines the existing and proposed institutions to deal with the problem of floods and manage them effectively. It also deals with the financial system in place and arrangements that are proposed for meeting the requirement of funds for implementation of the various proposed interventions and flood management measures, both structural and non-structural. The third chapter deals with prevention, preparedness, and mitigation. It presents an outline of the various types of structural and non-structural measures for managing the floods. Action plans for their implementation have also been prepared. The fourth chapter is about flood forecasting and warning. This is an important measure for minimizing loss of life and properties and assists the authorities concerned in prompt and effective response during and after floods. Action plan for the strengthening and modernization of existing flood forecasting and warning network, as well as development of a decision support system for management of floods, has been drawn up in this fourth chapter. The fifth chapter deals with dams, reservoirs, and other water storages, both natural and man-made. These are an effective means for reducing the flood peaks in the rivers. The important role played by them in flood moderation and comprehensive mechanism for operation and regulation of reservoirs, which takes into account the international, interstate, and inter-regional aspects, have been dealt with in this chapter. As large dams and reservoirs have the potential for huge damage, guidelines for ensuring safety thereof have also been detailed. Moving on. The sixth chapter deals with regulation and enforcement. Unplanned and unregulated development activities in the floodplains of the rivers and encroachments into the waterways have led to increase in flood losses as well as flood risk. The colossal loss of lives and property due to the flooding of the towns and cities and the areas which get flooded almost every alternate years is a recent phenomena, and effective steps are required for regulating unplanned growth in the floodplains and preventing encroachment in the waterways. The measures for making the structures and buildings capable of withstanding the floods and serving as temporary shelters for the flood affected people have also been dealt with in this sixth chapter. The coordination required among the various agencies and state governments for effective flood management in interstate rivers and among various stakeholders for effective response has also been highlighted in this chapter. The seventh chapter deals with capacity development and covers the aspects of education, training, research and development, and documentation with respect to flood management. The proposals for strengthening the existing systems are also given. An action plan for capacity development has been formulated. The eighth chapter deals with the various aspects of flood response. An effective and prompt response to floods is very important for minimizing the loss of lives and properties. And what is more important, providing immediate relief to the affected people. The role of communities and NGOs is vital in search, rescue, and relief operations. Immediate medical assistance to the affected people and steps for prevention of outbreak of epidemics after the floods are essential components of flood response. The ninth chapter deals with implementation of the guidelines. As far as the flood management plans are concerned, the National Executive Committee has been entrusted with the responsibility of preparing the national plan for disaster management and getting it approved by the National Disaster Management Authority. These guidelines on flood management will assist various stakeholders, that is, central ministries and departments, state governments, Panchayati Raj institutions, and urban local bodies. District disaster management authorities, NGOs, and the community at large will also be benefited in the preparation of flood management plans, which in turn will form the basis for preparing the national flood management and overall disaster management plan. The 10th and final chapter is the summary of action points. It lists out various action points to be implemented by the central ministries and departments concerned and the state governments, state disaster management authorities, and the district disaster management authority. Now, there are in all 94 action points which will assist them in the formulation of flood management plans, and the implementation thereof will result, hopefully, in effective management of floods in India. So let's have a look at the action points for chapter 1. Now, if you remember, this chapter deals with status and context of floods. As far as flash floods are concerned, the action plan states that, firstly, flash flood forecasting and warning system using Doppler radars will be installed by the India Meteorological Department by September 2009. Secondly, as a preventive measure, the inhabitation of low-lying areas along the rivers, nalas, and drains will be regulated by the state governments, the state disaster management authorities, and the district disaster management authorities. Thirdly, landslides and blockages in rivers will be monitored by the Central Water Commission, the National Remote Sensing Agency, the state governments, and the state disaster management authorities with the help of satellite imageries. And in case of their occurrence, warning systems will be set up to reduce losses. If possible, appropriate structural measures to eliminate the damage in case of sudden collapse of the blockages will also be taken up. After flash floods, the action points deals with areas prone to floods. The Ministry of Water Resources and the state governments will urgently undertake identification of areas prone to floods along with the names of villages and taluks or tehsils and districts in a scientific manner in collaboration with the National Remote Sensing Agency and the Survey of India. The action plan notes that for assessing the damages caused by floods, there is a lack of documentation on floods and flood damage. The state governments will ensure that each and every flood event is properly documented and flood damage assessment is made on a scientific basis with the help of the latest technological advances in the field of remote sensing through satellites, etc. For drainage congestion and water logging, the action plan mandates that the Ministry of Water Resources, along with the Ministry of Agriculture and the state governments, will, by the end of March 2008, make a scientific assessment of the area suffering from drainage congestion and water logging. For dealing with river erosion, the action plan states that the Ministry of Water Resources, along with the state governments, will undertake river-wise studies of the problem of erosion and estimate the area liable to erosion by rivers, identify vulnerable spots, and plan remedial measures to protect such areas. Latest technological developments for low-cost measures will be considered while planning. Talking of the littoral drift in river estuaries, the action plan states that straight cuts into the sea with a view to make the slope steeper in outflow reaches are sometimes considered as one of the effective measures to overcome the problem. These measures must be taken only after an intensive study on the mathematical and hydraulic models is carried out so as to avoid the risk of increased flooding. In case of high tides, cyclonic storms, and tsunamis. That is, it should not have an opposite effect. For snow melt, glacial lake outbursts, formation and subsequent bursting of landslide dams, The action plan says that the Ministry of Water Resources, the Central Water Commission, and the state governments will, in collaboration with National Remote Sensing Agency, monitor the hilly areas liable to snow avalanches, blockages in rivers due to landslides, etc. for such events. In the case of their occurrence, they should install warning systems for reducing the loss of life and property in the areas likely to be affected. They will also take remedial structural measures if feasible for averting the danger. Coming to cloudbursts, the action plan directs the India Met Department and the Central Water Commission, in association with state governments, to develop forecasting and warning systems in areas prone to floods caused by cloudbursts. Dealing with the international dimension of flood hazard, the action plan lays down that negotiations upon issues such as establishment of hydrometeorological stations and transmission of their data to India on a real-time basis, afforestation, catchment area treatment works, and construction of reservoirs will be expedited by the Ministry of Water Resources and the Ministry of External Affairs. Now, are you observing? The action plans actually have planned for all contingencies. Well, implementation is another story altogether. So, the action plan also talks of the implementation of the recommendations of the experts committees, working groups, and task forces. The Ministry of Water Resources and the Central Water Commission will, in collaboration with the state governments, closely monitor the implementation of the recommendation of the experts committee to review the implementation of the recommendations of the RBA, that is the Rashtriya Baad Ayog 2003, and the Task Force on Flood Management and Erosion Control, which was set up in 2004. We now move on to the action points for Chapter 2. The second chapter of the guidelines deals with the institutional framework and financial arrangements. The action plan lays down that the National Institute of Disaster Management will network with other knowledge-based institutions and assist in imparting training. It will also be responsible for synthesizing research activities and will be geared towards emerging as a center of excellence at the national and international levels. The action plan also calls upon the Ministry of Water Resources to strengthen and equip the Central Water Commission, the Ganga Flood Control Board, and the Brahmaputra Board. The plan calls upon the ministry to establish the National Flood Management Institute as a center of excellence in close collaboration with the NDMA. The plan says that all state governments will appoint experts in flood management in the faculty of their administrative training institutes, which will collaborate with the NFMI in organizing the training of personnel. Every state government will constitute a state executive committee to assist the SDMA in the performance of its functions. To augment their capacities, all state governments will organize from within their armed police force adequate personnel for the constitution of state disaster response force with appropriate disaster response capabilities. Talking of funding, the action plan states that the various measures for flood management, as recommended in the guidelines, will be funded by the central ministries and departments and state governments concerned by making provisions in their annual and 5-year plans. Remember, this was at the time when the 5-year plans were still there. Funding will also be available through special mitigation projects to be formulated and implemented by the state governments under the overall guidance and supervision of the NDMA. In addition, 10% of calamity relief fund can also be utilized for purchase of equipment for flood preparedness, mitigation, rescue and relief. On the need for flood insurance, the action plan lays down that the ministries of finance, agriculture and water resources, the state governments and the insurance companies will jointly take up studies for a graded system of insurance premium according to flood risk in flood prone areas of the country. The Ministry of Water Resources, in consultation with the state governments, will explore the possibility of introducing schemes where insurance of structures, buildings, and crops in floodplains is made compulsory. The value of such scheme cannot be overstated. Coming to chapter 3 of the guidelines, which is on flood prevention, preparedness and mitigation, the action plan talks of construction of embankments, river banks, flood walls and flood levees after carrying out detailed hydrological and morphological studies regarding their favorable and adverse effects. It is only then that embankments with properly designed and located drainage sluices, spilling sections, and anti erosion measures, in combination with other works such as reservoirs, channel improvement works, drainage improvement structures, etc., will be planned and implemented as a short term or long term solution to the flood problem. Ongoing embankment projects will also be reviewed with respect to the location and designs. Talking of the need for channel improvement, the action plan says that the state governments will identify the locations and take up appropriate channel improvement works to increase the velocity and or the area of flow and reduce the flood level in the rivers depending upon site specific conditions. The action plan also talks of exploring the viability of desilting and dredging as a remedial measure to mitigate the effects of rise in the river beds. The issue of drainage improvement has also been dealt with. Talking of diversion of floodwater, the action plan states that wherever the capacity of river channels passing through the towns and cities is inadequate and cannot be improved to the required extent, state governments will study the feasibility of implementing schemes for diverting excess water to existing or new channels by bypassing them, obviously to prevent flooding. The plan mandates the state governments to take up appropriate watershed management measures, including afforestation, check dams, detention basins, etc., in the catchment of rivers to prevent soil erosion, enhance water conservation, and minimize water and sediment runoff. The plan says that sea walls and coastal protection works will be planned and executed by the respective coastal states or port authorities, keeping in view the complexity of sea behavior and other environmental aspects. It further says that dams, flood embankments, levees, and the works taken up for their protection against erosion, etc., will be regularly inspected during floods for identification of vulnerable spots, and immediate measures to strengthen them will be implemented. In case of apprehension of any breach or overtopping, people living in the area will be warned of the danger, and the civil administration, with the help of the National Disaster Response Force or the State Disaster Response Force, and or the army, will take steps for evacuation, rescue, and relief. Accepting the social role of the government, the action plan says that the state governments will provide adequate number of raised platforms or food shelters at suitable locations in the floodplains with basic amenities such as drinking water, sanitation, medical treatment, cooking, tents, lantern, etc., for the people to take shelter during floods. Talking of creating awareness, the plan says that the state governments will take steps to create awareness of the types of illnesses and other health problems that can result in the aftermath of floods to all the medical teams and the community at large. Hygienic practices, for example, hand washing with soap and use of the toilet for defecation, use of boiled water or adding chlorine to water, and safe food cooking by disease free persons will be promoted. The plan says that state governments will also ensure the creation of trained medical first responders for first aid and resuscitation measures for drowning cases. Medical kits will be prepared for the management of flood casualties, and all hospitals are to prepare disaster management plans. Moving on, Chapter 4 of the guidelines talks of flood forecasting and warning in India. The Central Water Commission, the India Meteorological Department, and the state governments have been directed to increase the density of the basin-wise network of rain gauge and river gauge stations and establish basin-wise system of early warnings and establish a system of cooperation with Nepal, Bhutan and China for modernization of the system of hydrometeorological observations, automatic sensors, and satellite based transmitters. Then, Chapter 5 of the guidelines is about dams, reservoirs, and other water storages. The action plan talks of studying the availability of natural depressions, swamps, and lakes in the vicinity of the rivers, and wherever required and feasible, utilize them for temporary storage of flood waters. It asks state governments to install automatic water level sensors with satellite based transmitters at all the reservoirs and share real time data among the basin states during the monsoon season. Chapter 6 of the guidelines is about regulation and enforcement. The action plan directs state governments to enact and enforce appropriate laws for implementing floodplain zoning regulations. It also talks about the possibility of removing buildings and structures obstructing existing natural drainage lines. It also asks for an appropriate legal framework to be developed by the state governments so as to make it mandatory for obtaining clearance for the plans for construction of infrastructure in flood prone areas. Chapter 7 of the guidelines deals with capacity development. The action plan asks state governments to strengthen flood management education by facilitating the incorporation of the best available technical and non technical inputs in education curricula. It also asks the Central Board of Secondary Education to introduce modules of flood management in classes 11th and 12th as well. The state governments will be encouraged to introduce a 5-year quality improvement program for teachers and professionals engaged in teaching the subjects related to flood management. Chapter 8 of the guidelines is about flood response. The plan, therefore, asks state governments to develop procedures for formally recognizing and certifying trained search and rescue team members. It talks about institutionalizing the role of community based organizations, non governmental organizations, etc., in incident command system. It says that at the village level, task forces will also be constituted on voluntary basis for better preparedness of the community. Talking of dissemination of information, the plan says that the state governments will utilize different types of media, especially print, radio, television, and internet, to disseminate timely and accurate information. NDRF battalions will also be provided with communication equipment for establishing last mile connectivity. and says that the fire and emergency services in the flood prone areas will develop adequate capacity to respond to serious flood situations, in addition to managing fires. It also talks of other issues like setting up the state disaster response force, building up national reserves of food and other items, planning of relief camps, emergency treatment at the site of floods by quick reaction medical teams, making of emergency medical plans, provision of safe and sufficient drinking water in the aftermath of floods, catering for handling psychological aspects and counseling to victims, and as usual, documentation of medical response. Chapter 9 of the guidelines is about the implementation of the guidelines and directs the preparation of the national, state, and district disaster management plans. It says that alternative arrangements for housing relief camps in flood prone areas will be put in place through various mitigation projects. Most important, it directs that the activities are to be mainstreamed into the development plans of the respective ministries, departments, and state governments, and they will be responsible for making adequate provisions in their annual plans and budgets. Well, that's all from me in this, the second video on floods. In the third and final video on the series, we shall study the National Disaster Management Guidelines on the management of urban flooding. This video is based on the information freely available on the internet. No originality is claimed for the same. The intention of this video is only to prepare candidates for answering examination questions on the subject and not for any financial gains. Do like and share this video and do subscribe to my channel now so that you do not miss out on my earlier or future videos. And if you wish to drop in a line, I shall always be available at sumitacademy20@gmail.com. Till later then, cheerio.